So, about 2 years after the snorkeling expedition down in the Bahamas, Dad came home one night and uh, approached Tucker and Annie and Mom with a new idea. He said, "I've found out about a great adventure we could have in Egypt. There's a guy there who takes you on camels out to an oasis way out in the desert, and you spend the night and uh, experience what it was like in ancient Egypt to be out in the desert. He's got permission from the government to do this, and I think it'd be an absolutely terrific uh, adventure." And so Tucker looked at Annie, and Annie looked at Tucker and said, "Another one of Dad's great ideas. Let's do it." So after school, they flew to Cairo and spent a couple of days in Cairo, met their guide, who was a young college student named Abdul, who was doing these uh, guided trips to make money for college. So Egypt, Cairo is really cool. There's the museum, the Egyptian Museum, which is absolutely wonderful with all kinds of stuff, mummies and sarcophaguses and all kinds of stuff. Some of King Tut's display is there. Then there's the Great Pyramids and the Sphinx outside. And I will tell you that I, as a young man, climbed um, the Great Pyramid, the biggest one. Um, and now that you're not allowed to do that, they stopped it many, 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 many years ago. But I want to tell you something. Those blocks that those pyramids are made out of were chest high on me, almost chest high. So scrambling up those blocks, getting all the way to the top, was quite an exercise. But I did. I stood on top of the Great Pyramid. It was really cool. So anyway, after 3 or 4 days of sightseeing, they connected with Abdul and took some backpacks with clothes and stuff. Connected with him and out on the outskirts of Cairo, and there were camels kneeling on the ground. Abdul, Mom, Dad, Tucker, Annie, a couple of helpers, and a couple of pack camels. Camels can carry 500 pounds. They're very good pack animals. Now, getting on a camel is quite interesting because they have a pad, and you climb up on the pad, and then the camel gets up hind end first, so you get pitched forward toward its head, and then um, uh, the front end second, so you get pitched forward and back really quick. And it's the same thing getting on or off. It's quite an experience. Anyway, so uh, they were dressed in t-shirts and shorts and stuff, but they had thin white robes on them to protect them from the sun because it was about 110 degrees out in the desert and really, really hot. So they were they were they went out and they went to a small oasis on the way because it took all day on the camels to get to the camping spot. And they went to a small oasis with a few palm trees where they had lunch. And Abdul had created a really, really good lunch. He was really good at this. And then they went on, and by the evening, they got to the big oasis, which had quite a good sized grove of palm trees and permanent wall tents set up for the season. One for the family to stay in, one for a kitchen tent to eat in, and one for Abdul and his helpers. And there was a porta potty because the Egyptian authorities wouldn't let him do this without a porta potty, and he had to haul the porta potty in and out on the camels at the beginning of the season and out about halfway through to and then back in and out at the end of the season. And the when they got there, the family noticed that there were ropes. There was a rope strung from the sleeping tent to the kitchen tent, from the sleeping tent to the porta potty, from the porta potty to the kitchen tent, and from the kitchen tent to Abdul's tent. These were wall tents, white wall tents. And um, uh, the the kid said, "Well, what what are those ropes for?" And Abdul said, "Well, every once in a while a sandstorm comes, and when a sandstorm comes, it's like what you would consider a blizzard. You can't see anything, and you have to have these guide ropes to get from one tent to another." And I said, "Oh, that's cool." And so they had supper and got in their tent, and the desert gets cold at night. It's hot as heck in the day and very cold at night. So they had sleeping bags, and Abdul had cots for them, and they all got. And in the middle of the night, a sandstorm did blow in. And when they got up in the morning, they went to the tent was really securely tied, but they went to the opening, the flap of the tent, and it was a big wall tent. You could stand upright inside it and looked out. And just as Abdul said, you couldn't see anything at all in the blowing sand. So, with the guide ropes, they made their way to the kitchen tent and they had breakfast. And Abdul said, we're supposed to spend one night here, but we're not going anywhere. We always have extra food just in case this happens. We're not going back today. We'll just stay put. And so they spent the day in the kitchen tent and in their tent, and they, to move around was they had to keep their eyes closed and hold onto the ropes and stuff like that. It was crazy. But that night, the second night, the storm ended, and the second morning, Abdul said, "Yeah, we're good. We're good to go." So they packed up the camels and started out back for Cairo. And it got to be about 11 o'clock in the morning, and the sky got all of a sudden darkened like crazy. And Abdul stopped all the camels and he handed out to each person a beeper. It went around your neck, and it was a black box, and it was a beeper just like you use for avalanche skiing. When you're skiing in avalanche territory, you turn it on to send when you're skiing, and on the camels they all turned theirs on to send, and it sends out a signal. And then whoever's looking for you has theirs set on receive, and they receive the signal and can track you down. And Abdul said, "We do this. We may get another sandstorm, and this will keep the camels will walk right behind each other, one after the other. We should be okay, but we use these as extra precaution. These beepers." So they all got their beepers on, stayed on their camels, and kept going. And the storm blew in. And they couldn't see anything. They had to pull their hoods of they had robes on to protect against the sun, but the robes also had hoods, came down over them, and they pulled the hoods down over their faces because the sand was just blinding and got everywhere, just was everywhere. And the storm went on and on and on for about 3 hours. And then it cleared, and the sun came out. And Annie is on her camel, and Tucker is right in front of her, and Annie threw her hood back, and there was Tucker on his camel, but no mom, no Abdul in front of him. She whirled around, and there was no dad, no helpers, and no pack camels behind her. And she yelled at Tucker, and he uh, flipped back his hood and saw what was going on. He said, "Now, don't worry." He said, "We've got the beepers. They will find us. I don't know what happened, how our camels got separated, but don't worry. They'll find us right away." But the camels kept walking, and the camels walked on for about 20 minutes and then came over a sand hill, and below them was a narrow, small little sand valley with a stream running in the bottom of it for about 300 yards. It looked like it came up out of the sand, ran across the sand, and down into the sand to their left in a sort of a sand canyon. Well, the camels went down the hill, got a drink, and then settled down on their knees. And Tucker and Annie hopped off, and Tucker said, "Well, there's a few bushes here from this water. I'm going to sit in the shade of the bushes, and they're going to show up. They'll find us. We don't need to worry. There's nothing to worry about." And Annie uh, she had calmed down. She said, "Yeah, they'll find us. I'm going to go explore." So she went downstream toward the little sand canyon. And about 10 minutes later, she yelled at Tucker, and he leaped up and shot down the stream. He thought something was bad, and she was standing on the other side of the stream, and he saw that the canyon was not made out of sand, it was made out of rock. And she was standing next to a smallish rock cliff, maybe 20 feet tall. And in the cliff was a crack. And she said, you got to see this." And he went across the stream. The stream was very narrow. He jumped across the stream and peered in the crack. And from the reflected sunlight, he could see a wall facing them. And on the wall was a painting, an Egyptian painting. Now, if you know anything about Egyptian painting, you remember that all the ancient Egyptians painted everything sideways. So everything was from the side view. That was their style of art. Everything was from the side view. So this was a picture of a man in a knee-length skirt carrying something, and it was all sideways. He was facing to their left. And Tucker says, "Listen, I'm going to run back. I've got a good flashlight in my pack. We need to go in and look at this." And Annie said, "I've got one too." So they ran back to the camels, got their backpacks, got a couple of flashlights, and went back to the crack. And they could easily fit in the crack. They got in the crack and started shining their lights around, and they found they were in a chamber, a rock chamber. The walls were covered with paintings, covered with all kinds of paintings of all kinds of scenes. And at the end of the chamber was a smooth wall covered with paintings, in the middle of which was a female figure with the head of a cat facing. It was not sideways. It was facing straight on. And Tucker goes, "That's weird. You remember at the museum we heard about there were several cat goddesses that the ancient Egyptians revered, and one of them was a cat who kind of looked over the burial of pharaohs and protected them." And he said, let's go look at that wall. So they walked down to the other chamber and they started looking at the wall. And he said, I think that cat is there as a warning not to go any further. And if there's a warning not to go any further, there must be something on the other side of this wall. And they searched and searched for about 25 minutes with their flashlights, couldn't find anything. And finally, Tucker put his flashlight flat against the wall so it threw a shadow across the wall. And in about 10 minutes, he discovered that one painting of a ship, of an Egyptian ship, which is called a dhow, near the cat had something peculiar. Now, a dhow, they're still used on the Nile today, but they have a slanting back mast. It slants from the front toward the back on an angle. And his flashlight showed that the mast on this dhow was not painted. It wasn't flat. There was a ridge of rock. The mast itself was made out of a piece of rock, thin, long rock. And he put his fingernail under it and pulled, and the rock pivoted away from the wall. And when that piece of rock pivoted and stuck straight out like a nail sticking straight out of the wall, there was a huge rumbling noise, and the whole wall started to move. From right to left, started to move. And it moved and moved and moved and went into a recessed compartment on the left side. And they were shining their lights into another chamber. And Annie looks in there and she says, there's something in there and it looks like a boat. And Tucker gets as far to one side as he can. He shines the light and he said, I think it is a boat. A full-sized, real boat. And Annie says, what's that all about? And Tucker says, well, if you remember, the ancient Egyptians believed that particularly pharaohs needed a boat to go into the afterlife when they died. And this is a full-size boat. Somebody important must have died. And then he said, let's go look at it. And he said, nope. He said, hold on. He said, you remember they also told us that these burial tombs were booby-trapped for grave robbers. And he looked down, and along the whole length or the width of the doorway was a mat, a woven mat. And it was about 4 feet wide, extending the whole 15 feet, 20 feet of the opening, just inside where the door had slid away. And Tucker looks at that and he kneels down and he puts his hand on it and it disintegrates. It was so old, the minute he put pressure on it, the whole thing disintegrated into 1,000 pieces and fluttered down into a trench 4 feet across, the width of the doorway, the bottom of which was filled with needle-sharp stakes pointing up. Tucker said, see? He said, this is a trap. Anybody stepping on that mat would have gone, if we'd stepped on that mat, we'd have gone down and we'd have been killed. And he said, there was the first booby trap. And he said, I think I can jump that. And he said, you sure? He said, yeah, I can jump it. And he said, I'm a little nervous about trying to jump it. So he backed up. She held both flashlights, and he ran down the chamber and easily jumped the 4 feet. Got to the other side. She flipped him a flashlight. He went over to the boat, looked at it, and he said, look, there's some oars in this boat, and they look like the wood is still pretty good. He said, I'll make a little bridge of oars across that trench over on one side, and you can walk over. And he said, I'll stretch out and grab your hand. In case you fall, I'll pull you to the other side. And he did. And the oars did not break. And she walked across and they examined this boat. It was a full-size dhow, a full-size dhow. And in the middle of it was a chair covered with dust, but looked yellow. And um, Tucker said, I don't want to get in that. We don't really want to disturb anything here. But he said, that could be a chair with gold leaf covering it. And he started flashing his flashlight around. And the far end of the chamber was another painted wall with another cat-like figure. Well, this time it didn't take him 10 minutes to find the dhow with a piece of rock, pull the rock, and another wall slid back. And beyond it was a chamber filled with bundles of, it was dust covered, but bundles and boxes filled 3 or 4 feet high with chairs, tables, all kinds of stuff. And Tucker goes, I'll bet that's the treasure, and I'll bet there's a sarcophagus in there of whoever was buried, and it must have been somebody important to have a full-size dhow in this outer chamber. And Annie says, let's go in. He said, no. He said, don't forget the booby traps. He said, the floor looks solid. I don't know what the booby trap is. The floor looks solid, but first of all, Abdul will want people from the Egyptian Museum, the Egyptian Antiquities, to come in and catalog everything and take it out bit by bit. So we shouldn't go in. So they went back outside, went up to the camels, and sure enough, in about an hour, they heard shouts, and over the hill comes Abdul, Mom and Dad, and the 2 helpers. And Tucker says, see, I told you, the beepers work great. And so, Mom and Dad and Abdul come down. You guys okay? Everything okay? And they say, yeah, everything's okay, but we want to show you something. And they all get off their camels and go down to the crack and go through the crack into the chambers. And they find the boat, show them the boat, and Abdul says, whoever was buried in here is very, very important. Usually the boats were miniature boats. This must have been a pharaoh or somebody close to a pharaoh to have a full-size dhow in their burial chamber. And they go to the second opening and they look in, and Abdul says, you are absolutely right not to go in. We want the antiquities people to come. They'll want to catalog everything and take it out piece by piece. This is a really important find. And one of his helpers started talking in Arabic, loud and fast. And Abdul started talking back to him, and they got into a big argument. And the helper kept pointing into the chamber. And Abdul briefly explained that the guy wanted to go in. And he was telling him he couldn't go in. They had to wait for the antiquities. And all of a sudden, the guy broke away and started to walk into the back chamber. And when he did, there was a noise. A noise. Now, this doorway wasn't as big as the doorway into where the boat was. This doorway was maybe 8 feet across. There was a noise. And it sounded like this. And the man's body was severed in half by a huge blade that swung out of one side of the doorway, out and back so fast they hardly could see it, and blood everywhere. And Mom screamed, Annie screamed, and turned away. And Abdul looked at Tucker and Dad and the other helper, and the other helper's eyes were huge wide because he had wanted to follow the first guy in. And Abdul said, Tucker, you were absolutely right. These tombs are booby trapped. So we're out of here. So they go out, get their camels, go back to Cairo. And an expedition is formed a few days later. Abdul reports to the authorities what they'd found. And all of the families, I mean, it was a huge find. And the Egyptian government paid all the hotel bills for the family. They paid Abdul's fee. They reimbursed them for Abdul's fee, all the hotel bills, everything, because they said you've done an incredible thing for Egypt. So the family was staying on for a day or two to find out about this expedition that Abdul was going to lead to the tomb. And so a whole bunch of Egyptologists and everything got ready, and they all set off. There were 10 of them, Abdul leading the way, and he'd used a global positioning device to mark the location of the tomb and stuff. And they took off one morning, and that afternoon, a humongous sandstorm, blew into Cairo with thunder, lightning, humongous. And it lasted all day and through the night. The next afternoon, Dad got a call from the hospital, from the Egyptian hospital. And he got the family together. He said, Abdul's down there in critical condition. We got to go to the hospital. They said, what happened? He said, the storm. Something happened with the storm. And they got to the hospital, and the doctor in charge said, this camel in the middle of the storm or towards the end of the storm walked into the outskirts of Cairo, and Abdul was on the camel and badly burned. Lightning must have struck right next to him. If it had hit him, it would have killed him and the camel. Nobody else has showed up. And so they said, do you think Abdul's going to be okay? And the doc said, I think so. I think he's going to be all right. We found some stuff on him, and we've got it here, and we've got to get a hold of the university. We got to get a hold of, his family's coming, and so on and so forth. And they looked at the table, and there was a twisted, molten piece of metal. And Dad said, what is that? And the doc said, I don't know. Best I can guess is it looks like a global positioning locator, and it's completely melted. And before they left, the family found out that no members of the expedition had ever been found, and that all the hills around near Cairo in this humongous sandstorm had been rearranged, had been restructured because of the wind. And no one was ever able to find a little valley with a stream in it and a rock canyon at one end. And that is the end of the story. Now, if you want a you want to work on a writing exercise, you can either write a description of Abdul and the expedition getting back to the tomb and something that happened there, um, or you can write. Well, that'd probably be the best writing example. The expedition makes it back, but there's a big surprise when they get there, and you can have a go at trying that as a writing exercise off the ending.